afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Policy Making and You. My name is Urvashi Agrawal. I am a legal editor and outreach coordinator at Manupatra, and I would like to welcome you all to this webinar by Civis and Manupatra. Today, we have with us Ms. Antaraa Vasudev, founder Civis, and Ms. Mallika, who is a consultation fellow for 23-24 at Civis. And in today's webinar, we hope to learn how policy making should be and is a part of our everyday lives and how we get impacted by it and how we can be a part of it. After all, the laws, the policies that are going to affect us, we should definitely have a say in it. And how we can do that, we are hoping to listen from Antaraa and Mallika. So welcome Antaraa and Mallika, over to you.
Thank you, Rishi, and thank you to the Manupatra team and for everyone who is joining us today. We are really looking forward to this webinar. I'd just like you to confirm that you can see my screen. Okay, excellent. So today's discussion is policy making, and we hope to cover both, little bits of both, the policy making process as well as your participation and involvement in it. Before I dive deep, I would love to call upon my colleague Mallika to join us and to just take us through a few of the initial first slides, after which I'll take.
All right. Hi guys. I hope all of you can see and hear me clearly. So I'll be taking you through essentially what is the life cycle of policy, how does policy get made in India, and sort of contextualize where exactly we fit in, right? As citizens. So firstly, let's understand how policy is made in this country, right? There are a bunch of steps that go into it. It's not a one-man process or a one-night process. It's something that takes very, very long. And it starts at the stage of first understanding what you want to impact through your policy, right? You need to essentially zero in on what your policy needs to impact. So for example, in an environment policy, you could look at various aspects, right? You could look at whether you want to deal with the water, sanitation, water conservation, elements of that, whether you want to look at like, how do you increase the tree cover in the country, or even the methodologies to do that, right? There are a bunch of ways you can impact policy within a space like environment. Similarly, for every domain, you have different kinds of impacts each policy can have. So the first step is to understand what your policy wants to achieve, right? So you zero in on setting an agenda for your policy, setting the goals of your policy in that sense, right? That's the first step. The second step is then, once you understand what your policy wants to impact, you get a proposal approved. You have a rough idea of what policy you're proposing, and given that there are various levels within government, you get those levels of government to approve your policy. So for example, you're a department within a ministry, right? So I'm going to assume that there is some understanding of this level here, but if not, of course, we have, we're going to have questions and answers. So we can probably walk you through a little bit more of this at that point, if it's not clear. But since we have a lot of ministries in our government, right? We have the Ministry of Home Affairs, you have the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting and things like that. So all of these ministries have different departments under them, and these departments have various like stakeholders, right? Secretaries, joint secretaries under them. So now these folks have to approve your policy for that to be considered even, right? To become law or to become policy in that sense. So that's the second step of it. After that, you go ahead and develop your policy. Now, a policy is not simply a goal, right? You can't just say that I want to achieve X without knowing how to do it. So you put down the rules that formulate your policy. You put down the various aspects that your policy wants to cover in greater detail. Policy proposals, if any of you have gone through them, can range from like being a 4-page set of rules, but they up to like right up to like being a 150 or a 200-page document even, right? When they're executive documents, when they're, for example, there's something called a green hydrogen proposal that's in the public domain right now. So they're looking at how you can also within the environment domain, but that's going to be a super, super lengthy document. So it depends on what your document and what your policy wants to impact, that you develop these proposals at whatever length that looks like. Now, after this stage, once your policy is ready in that sense, you go ahead and assess its effectiveness and impact. You go ahead and see what it will achieve within the future. What can you expect from it? You did that at the first step as well, but you want to sort of do that in much greater detail now that you know what your policy looks like, right? So that's the fourth step. Fifth step is, of course, the implementation of the policy, on ground effectiveness, on ground ensuring that the stakeholders are complying with your policy. They're doing what it takes for that policy to see fruition, right? So you go ahead and implement your policy. And finally, in the long term, you want to sustain that policy. You don't just want to have your stakeholders interact with this policy or undertake the compliances of the policy just for a short period of time. You want this to be for a longer period of time. With that being said, there are, of course, certain policies that are shorter frame policies, but this, by and large, most policies, you foresee a long-term future for them. So you go ahead and ensure that it's maintained by the people that need to maintain it, right? So that's the life cycle of a policy. We'll go ahead and see how this policy now comes into being, and this is particularly with laws, right? So these can be acts, rules, regulations, any of those, anything that's a law essentially needs to be passed through parliament, right? Parliament is the legislative house of the government. So in the government, we have legislative, executive, judiciary. This is the legislative aspect of it. That is the wing of the government that has the authority to pass laws that we have to then go ahead and adhere to, right? So now, what are the steps that a policy needs to take to pass through the legislative? Now, again, I'm sure you all have studied this in civics, but just to give you a very, very brief rundown, right? You have two houses of parliament within India, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Any kind of an act or bill or any kind of legislation can originate in either of these two houses. So this life cycle that you see in front of you on the screen can happen in either of these houses. But to remember that there are certain laws that can only be passed, can only be originated within the Lok Sabha. We'll not go into that in great detail, but this is just for some added information, right? So now wherever this bill is originating, be it the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha, it's first introduced. At this stage, there's no discussion. You just go ahead and put this bill out within the house. Now, sorry, one more clarification. A bill is any law that's not passed yet. So a draft law is called a bill. So any bill that's not yet effectuated is going to be first tabled, right, within the house. The second step would be a second reading of this bill, right? Either the bill is then discussed, taken up for discussion by the people of the house. So in Lok Sabha, the total strength of the Lok Sabha that is present on that day and participating in discussion, or within the Rajya Sabha as well. Or if everyone doesn't want to discuss it. Now, we know that the number of members of parliament are huge, right? They're close to 500 in the Lok Sabha and close to 200 in the Rajya Sabha. Now, if these many people can't go ahead and debate it and create quality discussion, right? You go ahead and then in these cases, refer the bill to a select committee or a joint committee. Now, these committees are going to be formed by the members of the parliament themselves, but they are a fewer number of members, right? They're going to be a smallest group of MPs that will then look at your bill. They consider a lot of detail as well, right? They go ahead and look at expert opinions, domain experts' opinions. They can also examine people, right? They can call people and take their, in-person kind of an opinion and have them be present before these committees. What this does is it creates some kind of a larger quality report, right? They have to submit a report at the end of this bill coming to them. And therefore, it can be then in greater detail that the House understands the context with which this bill is coming and things like that. So you add a lot of quality discussion in cases when the bill goes to the select committee or a joint committee. Now, the House then gets back the bill from the joint committee. They look at the bill clause by clause, and each clause is then discussed and voted upon, right? So now it's not that your bill gets passed in entirety. It's that you look at each clause within the bill and then it gets passed and becomes policy if it gets passed, right? So that's what we look at in the third reading. There are cases in which the bill doesn't get passed. That is, majority of the members of either of the house, wherever this is happening, don't go ahead and agree with the bill. So they reject the bill, right? It's not passed and it doesn't become law or policy in that case. However, if majority of the members accept the bill, it then becomes law or policy and then becomes the law of the land in that sense. But you'll have to do this step again in the other house. So if this is happening in Lok Sabha, this bill then goes to Rajya Sabha, this whole process happens, and then it becomes final law or policy after the president's assent, right? So that's the life cycle of a law or a policy. A little additional caveat to this is also, again, we won't go in greater detail. If I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but for those who don't, not all bills get passed by just a majority. So majority is like 50% of people, more than 50% of the members of parliament that are present and voting in the parliament, in that particular house. If they agree with the bill, then it's called a majority agreement, right? However, some bills require special majorities, more than 50%. For example, if you want to impeach the president of India, you need 2/3 majority. So these are largely way more important decisions that our constitutional, the framers of our constitution decided that it's not sufficient to have a majority vote on these things. We need a slightly higher threshold. There are also other sort of frameworks that exist for this, like states have to also agree, and things like that, right? You can go ahead and read about that if you're very interested about it and you're not aware of it already. But yeah, that's essentially the life cycle of a policy within parliament. We can then go ahead and look at what the problems are of this method that I've spoken to you about, right? So now you largely understand from what I've told you that this entire life cycle is happening far away from us, probably at the central government, right? You and I and most of us, unless you are in Delhi, are not sitting near Lutyens, are not really participating in the process that's creating laws, right, or policies. Then how do we do that? How are our laws then binding us when these laws are made in vacuum? And for most of us, so laws affect different people differently, right? So if people that are impacted by a law are not giving their feedback or their thoughts on a law, then how is it effectively regulating us, right? That's something that we need to think about. And that's something we will talk to you about, because a solution does exist, but we will talk to you about that eventually in this conversation that we're having, right? Yeah, and one more important thing is that today we can also measure, I'm sure this is happening since time immemorial, right? We've had citizen participation within the governance structure. But now that we are on the internet, now that we have access to people, not just within our immediate circles, we can go ahead and talk to other citizens in the country, like across the country or even outside the country. And we've noticed that these citizens, especially young citizens, are extremely interested in being a part of governance procedures. They want to go ahead and voice their opinion. They actively take part in protests. They volunteer in government initiatives and things like that. So this is something that's a big positive. And we will look at how this then gets incorporated into citizen participation in our policy making process, right? Yeah. So now, how do you get involved? Now there is a process that exists for this, like I said. It's called public consultation. What is public consultation? Anytime, like I said, a bill, a draft law or a draft policy is put out for public opinion, you can go ahead and provide your feedback and opinion and suggestions to the government. And the government then takes it into account, right? Ideally, they take it into account. We will also talk to you about when they have taken into account these suggestions and what that looks like, right? But public consultation essentially is the process where your feedback gets incorporated or is at least taken by the government on draft laws and policies. Yeah. Now, we essentially understand that this is very important in a participatory democracy, right? Why is it important? Because citizens, at the end of the day, we do vote for our members of parliament, we do vote for our representatives. But at the end of the day, we also need to understand that that doesn't end the decision-making process, right? The laws that are made, they're made every day. We have evolution of our governance model every day, which means that we need to be vigilant and ensure that at least we have the path and the access to be able to provide our opinion on these changes and on these evolving laws, right? Which is why we need the process to then be transparent so that we know what's happening, and then our voice can reach the government. And then if the government is responsive to the comments that we make, that's something that we can then look at, right? But the first step is for us to be allowed to participate in this process, which public consultation does. Yeah, so that's essentially what policy making and public consultation looks like. I hand it over to Antaraa to take you through the specifics of the pre-legislative consultation policy and how we participate within it.
Thank you, Mallika. So, Mallika has actually taken us through the lawmaking process very, very well and in great depth. Thank you for refreshing some of the things that I had forgotten myself from civics class. So, really appreciate that. I think what I also just wanted to mention is that aside from the bills that become laws, there is a lot of delegated legislation that takes place in the country as well. Now, what is delegated legislation? Delegated legislation essentially refers to a particular provision where a particular organization, let's say, for example, the Ministry of Finance, says that I don't want to get into the nitty-gritties of making income tax rules. So I'm going to delegate that to the Revenue Service, and that duty of legislation or rule making around income tax becomes the responsibility of the income tax department. So, or the Indian Revenue Service, right? So those are the ways in which lawmaking actually does take place in the country. So everything happens at a legislative level, but it can also happen at an executive level. Now, this entire process that we've outlined for you is almost replicated to some degree, even at the state level. And there are different lists of which kind of matters state governments can govern upon and which kind of matters the union government can govern upon, right? So you can imagine there's a lot of laws that are being created in our country on a day in and day out basis. Mallika very rightly took up and spoke about how this process can be influenced by you and how it's important. So what I'm going to do now for the next few minutes is take up the mantle to go a little bit deeper into what this policy is all about and how your inputs as a citizen can actually make their way into the law and policy making process. So it all starts with the pre-legislative consultation policy of 2014. Now, prior to 2014, the government of India had instituted standing committees, they had instituted the planning commission, they had instituted very many different modes to gather public feedback into the process. However, in 2014, we got a particular document called the Pre-Legislative Consultation Policy, which is almost an international standard document for how to consult more people on every law and policy that gets drafted in the country. This is really a very landmark decision because it's not often that such big steps are taken in the legislative domain to include citizens, to include you, to include me, and to include all of our voices in the policymaking process. So let me talk about this a little bit. This particular policy was introduced by the Government of India to ensure that draft legislation undergoes a process of public consultation before it is finalized. According to this policy, every draft law is supposed to be published in the public domain for at least 30 days via the Gazette of India, the ministry's particular website, mygov.in, or interestingly, if that policy pertains to, for example, let's say a tribal community or a community which is outside the realm of regular communication, it becomes the government's responsibility to actually take the content of this law, make them aware about the process, and solicit their feedback, right? So there are multiple ways, and the responsibility is on the government to be able to gather that input. What this policy also says is that each of these laws have to have, along with it, a brief summary of the legislation, as well as the social, economic, political implications of that particular legislation on their targeted population. The government is supposed to make sense of all of this feedback, and also then respond to every comment to say why it has been incorporated or why not. Now, since 2014, and I know 2014 is now going on almost 10 years, so it seems like it's a decade-old problem. But just for context, decade-old problems are probably the newest problems we're facing in the public policy domain, right? So it's an area of evolution. It's an area of practice that we are actually working very closely with the government on to build and to improve over time. So we'll talk about some of the challenges of public consultations, what happens when it doesn't go as planned, or what are some of the other avenues through which we can participate in consultations later in this presentation. But for now, I want to focus on the benefits of public consultations. Why participate really? Like, is anybody really listening? And making laws is still the lawmaker's job now. So what does it have to do with me? Let me take you through a couple of the benefits of public participation in lawmaking. The first is that the laws that are formed are not just contextual, but they're also relevant. Today, if anybody is supposed to make, let's say, like Mallika was talking about, a green energy policy for hydrogen electricity and hydrogen generated power, it is good that the people who are engaged in that field are consulted with and are taken feedback from. The second benefit is that it promotes transparency and accountability. Now, any of us who've been tracking closely the data protection bill, which is meant to come up in the monsoon session of Parliament, we know that since 2018, which is when Civis actually started, there have been iterations and iterations and iterations of the policy. Now, from 2018 to today, 2023, you can see how the government has been making alterations, what they have been changing. And this entire process actually brings in a lot of transparency and accountability. Third, and most importantly, this is even something that's mentioned in the pre-legislative consultation policy itself, that it provides legitimacy to decision making. It provides data and evidence for decisions made, which fall very neatly into the policy making cycle that Mallika took us through on slide 2. Interestingly, in our experience, what we have found is that effective consultation also reduces the implementation costs of a particular policy. What our work has shown is that essentially consulting with the community results in much more cost-effective solutions that the community themselves has, but the government just needs to implement. I have an example here where in Gurgaon in 2018, we were doing a particular consultation and the development authority over there wanted to provide free or affordable healthcare to migrant laborers in the city. At that time, we had met one gentleman who was a senior citizen who had retired, who actually led the Senior Citizens Association in Gurgaon. He came and he said, Beta, and I'll just slip into Hindi for a quick minute. I don't know much about this policy, but I can tell you that in my experience, if you're trying to give affordable healthcare beds across the year, chances are that your migrant laborers will only use them in certain seasons and otherwise it will go vacant. So it's very important to adjust the allocation of affordable healthcare in the months where the laborers' influx is higher. Now, a very small, simple solution like this can actually save the government a lot of money and can also make sure that the policy is implemented more effectively. This feedback was one of 37% of the feedback that actually got taken into that policy. So it did have a successful impact on ground as well. The kind of transparency that this process actually allows for ensures that governments and citizens work together and in tandem to understand each other and to solve problems together. Now, all of us know that as citizens, we have certain responsibilities and we have certain duties. But one of the things that we have to always keep in mind, and I'm sure all of us do this, is that the core of active citizenship is going above and beyond to actually support institutions to build a better society, right? That is something that we need to do as a part of our role as citizens. And what organizations like Civis do is just make that process easier. What Manupatra does, for example, for accessing the systems of justice, or what Civis does for accessing the systems of policy making, is just reduce the barriers to access, right? But none of us can take the role of the citizen who actually goes and voices a concern, or who actually goes and takes that first step of action. So these processes merely allow us to work together, and our organizations actually help us come together. So I'm going to take us through two examples, one where there was no public consultation and the second where there was effective public consultation. And we'll pose some of the differences in these two examples, and then we'll open it out for question and answers. So no public consultation. India came out with a shark fisheries policy in 2019. So there was a Wildlife Protection Act under which certain categories of sharks could not be fished. And this was something that they wanted to change because the shark populations fluctuate. And it's a very delicate ecosystem balance that needs to be maintained. Now, Unfortunately, for this particular consultation, there was no public consultation. So fisher people in different parts of the country were not asked for their input. As a result of this, what was done was that certain amounts of fishing or certain kinds of fishing were actually banned. Now, the most damaging kind of fishing that needed to be banned was trawl fishing or trawler fishing, where large nets are dragged across the seabed, and those trawlers catch anything. It could catch a shark, it could catch fishes, it could catch anything at all. It could be any kind of like seabed sediment, etc., that actually helps the marine ecosystem. Had they consulted with the community and had they actually engaged with them, they would have seen that the community has a very sustainable way of fishing called long lining. In long lining, what you do is you release a long line, as you can see all the way down here, and this line has multiple hooks. So you don't just pick up everything with the ocean floor. What you do is you slowly reel in the line, and if the second, let's say, a fish comes out of the water, you see that it's an endangered species, you can simply unhook it, save its life, and release it back into the water with zero damage, right? So in trying to solve for the problem of these particular sharks, what has happened is that there has been a policy intervention which has not been practical, and has actually damaged the economic incentives of the communities that live along the sea. Whereas if we'd spoken to them about it and consulted with them on it, chances are that we would have learned about long lining. We would have understood the science behind effective fisheries and sustainable fishing, and been able to design a policy that actually accommodated best practices. Let's look at an example where effective public consultation has taken place. And for this, I'd like to take us back to 2020, the start of the pandemic. The Transgender Persons Protection of Rights rules was drafted by the by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. And these particular rules had a few conditions which were a little difficult for the community to agree with or acquiesce to. These included getting a mental health certificate to certify that a person was transgender, getting a physical verification at the hands of the district magistrate to certify that they were transgender. All of these things were not agreeable to the community. However, this particular consultation was actually put out for public consultation. Here is where Bonita comes in. Bonita is a citizen who identifies as a transgender woman and participated in these consultations. She, along with other members of the transgender community, came in and shared their feedback, detailed inputs to say, you know what, if you make this field in this form actually mandatory, I won't be able to fill it. They came in and they gave diverse inputs that were actively considered by the ministry. And in a period of just 2 months, we saw that 52% of the concerns that only came on Civis's platform were actually adopted, taken into the law and implemented. Ever since then, there have been lakhs of transgender people who have been able to apply for and get access to or start the process of obtaining their transgender identity cards. So this is where public consultation actually plays a very active role. And this is where our voices, no matter how small we think they are, can actually make a very tangible and important difference into policy making. I think what are our next steps? One is to encourage amplification of citizens' voices from every field that you work in. Two is to also acknowledge and realize that as citizens, we have many democratic superpowers. So it's not perhaps adequate just to vote once every few years, but also to be able to engage with your lawmakers, engage with your local body officials, engage with your residents' welfare associations, and make sure that change is sustained over a longer period of time. All of this is so that instead of conflict, consensus is built, and we have the ability to work together for a stronger future that we want to see in the country. So with that, thank you so much for hearing me out. I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back to Urvashi to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Antaraa and Mallika. And it was lovely hearing you both. And as a citizen, it is nice to know कि, okay, somebody is listening. If there's a policy which is going to be there and it is going to affect me and I do not feel okay with it, there's somebody I can reach out to. And with a platform like Civis, it's just easier to do so. Otherwise, we also, have all the draft notifications and everything that come. We have all of that available on Manupatra. And I, as a lawyer, at times find it difficult to make sense of it. So with organizations like Civis coming in and making the process easier and making the language easy for people to understand, it's like we are a great team, if I can say that. Okay, you have the original thing here, you have the easy language here. This is how you can reach out to people who are making the laws for you, and bring the change that you want to. So now, if anybody has any questions, the floor is open for questions. You can unmute yourself and please feel free to ask your questions. Otherwise, I have a couple of questions in the chat as well, a couple of questions that came to me in the Google form, so we could begin with that. Anybody, any questions, please feel free. I think I'll just start with the questions which I have with me. That sounds like a better idea. So the first question which I have, Antaraa, is, I think we have sort of answered this after this whole discussion, that is it very important to know the people's opinion about the subject for which policy will be created? So yes, would you like to say something on this?
Oh, absolutely. So I think that's a very good question to start with, because it's a very fundamental question as well. I think one of the things that I'd like to highlight, Urvashi, is that it's our lived experience which actually makes the most difference in a policy.
That is true.
All of us tend to think, okay, this is the domain of experts, and there are certain policies like the green hydrogen policy, for example, which is one of those, right? But let's look at it from this perspective. If consumers are not willing to buy green hydrogen cars for whatever reason, let's assume that it's a safety or security reason, chances are that the policy itself will be ineffective in achieving its objective. What is the objective? To have a cleaner, greener environment, right? So every stage of the policy making process, and there are policies that come out for the specifications of the engine motor types of the coast of wind, of water turbines off the coast of Kutch, right? I'm not saying we have to contribute to that. But what I'm saying is that citizens' opinions actually do make a difference in policies on environment, in policies on urban governance, on IT, health, social justice, things that we experience every day that we can talk about. And that is exceptionally important to the entire policy making process.
Okay, thank you so much. My next question is, are citizens of India really involved in policy making, or it is only a vague statement?
Right. So I think, Urvashi, the involvement is growing, right? We are, because like I was saying, the entire pre-legislative consultation process is only a decade old in India. Yes. In countries like the USA, for example, this is an interesting example. They had the first aspects of citizen involvement in policy making that were drafted in 1947. So at the time that we were just getting independent, they had already figured it out, right? They had already said that, okay, we want all of these things to be done, and we're going to draft an administrative procedural act that kind of, pulls these things together. South Africa has had this system for a while. Many other countries have had this system for a while. In India, it's very new. So as with many other things, it holds or gives us the advantage to actually leapfrog. In the US at that time, you probably had to make physical representations, right? Now in India, you can share your feedback on a consultation over WhatsApp, etc., etc. So in that way, it really helps us leapfrog into the next generation of the future that we want to see. So it's not always a disadvantage, but I feel like if after this call, 10 people go and get more engaged with the policy-making process, then we'll have our answer.
Definitely. We are not where we would like to be, but we are definitely making a progress, and more people are getting involved in the process, I would say. So my next question is, how does one get, for example, Mallika gave us a very short summary, helpful, very helpful, but still short. So if somebody wants to get a deeper understanding of how does policy making work and they want to read about it, then do you have any suggestions on that? How does one get a deeper understanding of all of that?
Sure, absolutely. So Mallika, do you want to start with your recommendations and then I can come in with mine?
Sure, of course. So if you want to understand the policy making process, right, I think it depends on what's the resources exist everywhere. I don't think you need to become someone who picks up a 500-600 page nonfiction book on public policy to do that. There are, of course, suggestions on those on that kind of like, resource as well. But you don't need to do that. So you can just go ahead and ensure that. So Indian Express and Hindu do explainers all the time, right? And those explainers are largely like they're technical, but they're also explained very simply so that an average citizen can understand. So you could start there, which is small enough for you to get involved. So they're not very long, they're short enough to get involved. You could also probably look at there are some books, of course, that you could pick up, but that really depends on what your capacity, like, what your interest level is, of course, right? You're not going to have the time or the energy all the time to be invested, in these kinds of processes. So maybe start there later, but start with like small explainers like that. You could go through YouTube videos as well. There are some channels that do like good explainers. I think the print has an explainer, like 30-minute video that comes out
Print
weekly.
does very good explaining
Um,
videos, that I agree.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So you could start with those. They're easier to digest, and you can also pace yourself accordingly. So that's what I would say to start off with. Yeah, but Antara?
Sure. So I think just one more recommendation, Mallika. I think you've answered this really well. One more recommendation is one of my favorite books is a book called Our Parliament. It's a very simple, easy to understand explainer. It takes you through all of the drama that you read about in the news when the Parliament session is on. Question hour, mein ye hua, and you're like, question hour. It gives you all of that breakdown of information. So do take a look at that. There are different books that have come out by the Oxford India Press also. So that's another resource that you can look at. There aren't a lot of domains that you can look at. But like Mallika said, it's always good to kind of go with something that interests you. So I know that there are one or two comments in the chat about how do you get involved with laws or policies that affect the common man, right? So maybe start with an urban local body. Start with your local neighborhood. My favorite suggestion to people to get started with the process of policy making and understanding it is to actually go and meet your corporator. So every ward should have a corporator who is responsible, who's a political representative, who's the elected representative of your ward. I really feel like going and having a cup of chai with your corporator is the best way to understand public policy, because you actually get a lot of good insights and start to understand some of their challenges as well.
Okay, great. And now that we talked about the getting involved in urban administration and everything, I'll come to my next question. Because I guess you'll agree that these RWAs and the resident welfare associations, I think they have a very important role to play, and they can play a very important role in urban administration and policy making and all. So would you like to say something on that, that how can RWAs contribute to policy making in the urban administrative scenario?
Sure, absolutely. So I can share some experience from Mumbai, and I think Mallika, if you want to come in as well. What happens is that over here we have a number of informal and formal residents associations, right? So RWAs are one, and I know in Delhi and surrounding parts they play a very active role in, for example, security, maintenance, etc. In a city like Mumbai, what you do is that you have another set of parallel authorities called ALMs, which are area locality management organizations, right? It's very similar to an RWA, except that it goes a slightly higher. So it's of multiple, let's say, larger regions that come together.
Societies, maybe.
Exactly. And they come together to have an ALM group. Now, this ALM group is very active. They are the people who the BMC themselves will call if they are ever concerned about something or actually engaged in something. So I do feel like these roles, these informal organizations play a very important role in policy making. It's just that it differs very greatly city from city into how much autonomy they are given. So, for example, in Bangalore, one of the initiatives that has been undertaken and continues to be undertaken is to give more autonomy at the very small unit level, right? So the process of kind of devolution started with the 73rd and 74th Amendment to the Constitution of India, which basically said that governance should not happen at the union or state level, but should in fact happen at the district, zilla, urban local body, and sub-district ward level, right? So that process of evolution has also been ongoing, where we are trying to give more autonomy to smaller local bodies that can actually take more active part of the policy-making process. However, I think that being said, it really differs from city to city how much autonomy the RWAs have and how they're actually able to leverage the process, also because it differs on how the municipality is receiving the RWA at that point of time.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I have another question, which is a very pertinent question. Like if people start, taking part in the public consultations and everything, so they want to know, like, are these views actually considered, or do we just send it somewhere and hope that it will be heard too?
So I can take a stab at this, and again, Mallika, come in. Yes, very much they are considered, 100%. Just the other day, I was on a call where somebody was saying, I submitted some feedback and I lost hope. And then 4 years later, this particular official called me and said, you remember that feedback you submitted, we're ready to consider it, right? So there are examples of this. It does happen, and we witness it on a day-to-day level, right? Every day when Mallika, in fact, tracks what has changed in a particular policy, she sees that citizens' inputs are being taken in and being incorporated. The challenge with policy making is that, and there's a Carnegie report on this as well, that Carnegie report says on average it takes regulators like TRAI, SEBI, etc., 2,336 days to turn back a particular policy. So after consultation, it takes them that much time to actually come back and share an updated version of the policy, right? And regulators are more organized than governments or our ministries, right? They have more resources and they have more abilities than some of the ministries do right now. So you can only imagine the time that it takes a ministry to actively consider feedback. But at the same time, for example, if you file an RTI and ask for citizens' feedback, ask what feedback came in, it's really encouraging to see that even where feedback has not been taken, very often the RTIs will show you a column that the ministry is keeping saying this feedback was not taken for X reason, Y reason, Z reason, right? So voices are definitely being heard. It's just that the policy making process itself is slow, and it is something that takes a lot of deliberation.
That gives me hope that, okay, people are being listened to. And I guess a lot of people here, even if 5-10 people go back and leave their feedback on policies and they hear a few years later, a few months later, so there's hope. We are being heard too.
I'll just come in here and add a bit, right? In that, so Civis does recognize that in that sense. Like we understand that there's some level of dejection that people face. So what we do is we end up ensuring that we track whether ministries are in fact, looking at our responses. And of course, like Antaraa said, it's a huge process, supremely long process to get a new policy or like a changed draft policy even, right? So even if we think that they're looking at our like comments, they're repeatedly considering it, through the process, that's something that Civis tracks. And we let people know, we let the people who are commenting know that that's happening, because we recognize that that is important, right? For a citizen to understand that their comment was just not left into the void, but rather something that's being looked at by real people and real people that have the power to influence policy making. So I think that's important, but yeah, that's something that we already do take into account, and we hope that pushes citizens to act, and we see that it is already working. So we hope it just grows every day.
Yeah, I'm sure it does, because if I see, okay, I have left one comment and it's been heard too, and something is happening about it, I'll be pushed to answer more and, take an active part in more consultations and everything. So it must be very encouraging for people. Okay, so I have a very interesting question here. Should the process of policy making be Indianized? And what they mean by this is, they've explained, that I mean no policy in India can be understood by layman except to the lawman, including the constitution. Shouldn't the process be more inclusive? And should it also not include vernacular languages? That I would agree with. If, as a lawyers, as you all of us are lawyers here, the three of us, so even we, sometimes have difficulty understanding the older acts or the very complicated ones. So we cannot understand people, expect people to understand all of this heavy writing that is being done. So that is where Civis is helping. That is amazing. So I think you should talk more about it. Okay, how can we, have a simpler one?
Right. No, thanks for that, Urvashi. And I completely agree. Layman and not lawman is a great sort of tagline to go with if anyone wants to dive deeper into this domain. But I think so a couple of things. One is I completely agree. I think the process does need to be made a lot more simpler, right? I think legalese should not be a barrier. In fact, legalese should be an enabler. It should be something that allows us to convey certain things, but not in a way that sets other people out from the conversation and prevents them from actually learning or understanding what is happening, right? To that effect, there is a body of work on plain language drafting, which has been done by the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. I think that's something that that we can go through, and also, just as a resource for everybody else. They actually go down to specifics as to how do you break down your sentences, how do you move away from just pure legal language drafting, how do you keep gender parity, evolving gender norms in keeping when you draft a law. So in that sense, I think there is a little bit of work being done here. We also have a question in the chat which says that where does India stand vis-a-vis other democracies? And this is something that I want to bring in here as well, because a lot of other democracies do in fact mandate plain language drafting. So there is a little bit of improvement that we need to be making on that domain as well. But I feel like over time, I think this process should happen with research and literature coming out of a lot of law schools, out of a lot of reputed think tanks. I'm sure this process of evolution will take place as we go along.
Would you like to add anything to this, Mallika?
I think Antaraa covered all of it, right? I think just the idea that we're a little bit behind, and that's where I think Civis also comes in terms of what we're trying to achieve when we put out a consultation, right? That's our primary goal, that it's digestible, it's comprehensible by anybody who's not a technical/legal person, right? So yeah, we hope that one day we don't have to be the middleman doing that in terms of just like having laws that are accessible. But yeah, there's a need to do that, and also we do also publish in Hindi, right? So that's currently our limitation. We do want to expand to other languages, but yeah, I think it's extremely important to have like both language and just understandable English language that exists right now within laws, right? But yeah.
Antaraa also touched upon something that I personally get very, angry is maybe a heavy word, but when I read a law, when I read a bare act, and like he shall be punished, he shall do this. It's high time. I am. People tell me you're expecting too much when I expect their laws to be written like they shall do this, or they shall know, they shall be informed. Like it's high time we could move on from the he language of every single law. So yeah, like Antaraa mentioned it, okay, the language and the gender parity while drafting the laws and everything is. So even if somebody sends me a draft of something and I just correct it, he shall not, they shall do this. Like, oh, Rishi, it will take time. This is how it will change. If you and I wait for it to change and then we start implementing, then it's never going to change. So thanks for that. Just two more questions. I guess I have three more questions, because one we cannot go without discussing. That is the how to make a career in policy making. And then I'll take the last two questions if you would like to add about the career in policy making right now.
No, absolutely. So I feel like a couple of things, Urvashi. I feel like I have a very non-traditional path, which is that I studied political science and then came into the domain just out of being curious. And I worked in different political parties. I worked with different civic technology organizations internationally, and that kind of brought me to this domain and brought me to the work that Civis does, right? Mallika has, she will talk about her sort of trajectory into this as well. But I feel like it's safe to say that there's no one way to do it. I feel like policy is such a sphere that, for example, if you were a geologist who was studying a very specific field of geology, right? There's a domain in policy which related to oil and natural gas, which is very relevant to you, and you can transition to policy from being in that space,
Yes.
right? You can transition to policy from being a dentist because public health is very relevant to you. So in that way, I feel like there are many avenues to get into policy making as a career. I think those avenues are becoming even more accessible now with platforms like Public Policy India, WILAC's Public Policy Square, and a few others. So it's becoming easier and easier to see opportunities that can use your skill set. But that being said, I think it is a very diverse and sort of multidisciplinary stream to get into. So there are many entry points. What do you think, Mallika?
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that. And what I wanted to just add is that I don't particularly see public policy as one career, right? I think what is public policy? It's essentially influencing the policies that govern us, and there are always going to be multiple of those and across various domains. So, like Antaraa pointed out very rightfully, it's that whether you're a geologist, a public health, a health professional, whatever that may be, right? What you need in that space is that you're interested in using your like domain knowledge / skills to create something larger than just your work that you're doing privately or like for a organization maybe. And again, nothing wrong with that, but it's just about if you want to influence public policy, that's all you need, right? You need to have something that you're contributing to for just policy making in general. That's not really limited to one domain. So no matter what domain you come from, you can enter public policy if that's what you want to do, right? There are various avenues to doing that, like Antaraa said. You should probably follow certain linked pages that put up these posts of various even if not jobs or like opportunities directly in that sense. But I think the most important thing in public policy that I have learned from my very, very short stint here, so I'm not going to attach a lot of value to that. It's just, I think it has served me well, so I'll just put it out there, is that you should be interacting with a lot of people. And I think that it's very, very important in public policy, because public policy is essentially about creating impact for the people, right? So the more you're able to understand that, like, say, for example, I'm a lawyer, right? So like I like to understand why laws are drafted a certain way, understanding legal language. These things have impacted me. But I met someone, at some event or some kind of like, a meeting place for public policy, where I learned that they're particularly interested in harnessing technology for public policy, right? Maybe understanding how civic participation is something that Civis does, but even other ways to have like tech policy directly, for example. Why should privacy laws look a certain way, and things like that, right? So when you kind of meet such people, then you understand, okay, my expertise in law is going to come in with their expertise in tech, and you understand how then policy is very intersectional. So you can't particularly isolate yourself in that way and saying that I'm a lawyer and I want to enter public policy. I'd really urge you all to go ahead and interact with people and understand again in what direction you can take those skills that you already have, and then you'll always build on them and see that there are other intersections that you'll have interest in, and then provide your inputs in. And of course, with that, you can go ahead and keep your eyes and ears open for opportunities, collaborate with people, read a lot, increase your expertise, and then eventually, of course, there's a lot of room for in policy making, only because we're a huge country, right? 1.4 billion people. There's enough room for like policy makers and policy influencers and everyone in between that's influencing like public policy in that sense. Yeah. So that's, I think, what I would like to say.
Well said, Antaraa and Mallika. And yes, I would agree. Public policy, the name itself has public, it cannot exist in isolation. We need to be talking to people. We need to be getting other people's perspective. public policy cannot be drafted depending on what the bubble we live in. Okay, this is what the world looks like around me, and this is how laws and policies should be. So that is great. I'll just ask my last question for today, and rightly so. I don't think there's a reason except the biases, but yeah, the question is, why are some policies discriminatory? A very simple question, but a very deep question at that. That why are some policies discriminatory?
So I think, Urvashi, I feel like there's a couple of reasons here, right? One is that oftentimes I don't think the intent is in question. I wouldn't question the intent of the policymaker, right? Nobody's intending to create any sort of like
Or leave out
widespread discrimination. However, I do feel like at certain times, what tends to happen is that there are three types of interests that sort of converge in a policymaking process, right? Sometimes we have a policymaking process which is kind of, or a policy which is slightly outdated. It just doesn't apply anymore. So if it doesn't apply anymore, chances are that in today's society, it will exclude somebody rather than include somebody. And there's another question here about how do policies get adjusted to adapting and changing circumstances. The real way to do it is just to kind of keep refreshing and keep creating new cycles of policy making. And chances are if there's an old policy, it might end up falling or being in the discriminatory category. I do feel another challenge that does tend to come up is the fact that certain policies are not well-rounded. So they are looking at one particular point of view and not the point of view of many others in that process. So I think that conflicting interests, older policies or policies that have come out without any sort of well-rounded thought or consideration from multiple stakeholders tend to be those which might be observed as being discriminatory towards some. I think the transgender rules example is one rule of how a policy which started out as being discriminatory actually changed and became something that was very positive and enabling just by taking feedback of the communities. So there is the process of sort of reworking some of these legislations as well, whether you do it through the legislative process or whether you challenge it in court. There are many ways and avenues and tools that we have as citizens that allow us to engage with this process and make sure that we're not just sort of party to what is happening, but have a role to play in changing it.
Okay, great. That was a nice answer, Antaraa. Thank you so much. I think this sounds like a good point to wrap this discussion up. And I loved it personally, and I'm sure our audience learned a few things or two, and they got interested to, learn about policy making, and maybe they could go visit civis.vote and see what consultations are active and all. So I loved the discussion. Anything you would like to add before we say bye-bye?
I think just wanted to thank you, Urvashi, the entire Manupatra team, and also our incredible audience, which has left some great questions and comments. Really enjoyed today's session. Thank you for having us.
Anything for you, Mallika?
No, same. Absolutely what Antaraa said. Thanks for having us, and thanks for being such a lovely audience, everyone. Your questions were really, really insightful for us as well.
So thank you, Mallika. Thank you, Antaraa, and thanks to everybody. We'll in a week or so we'll put up this video on YouTube as well. So if you've missed out anything, or if you would like to share this discussion with more people, then you can visit Manupatra's YouTube channel and you can see this discussion again. And you can reach out to either of us at contact@manupatra.com if you would like to talk about it more and anything at all. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Bye.